use him to speak your word with authority, with conviction and with power. In Jesus' name. And give us the ability to receive it in faith. Amen.
All right, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Paul, for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to sharing this message today. It's just normally a few weeks before I come, God would almost reveal a theme to me, and then I almost start with that, and I often end up in a completely different place to where I originally thought I'd be. But yes, it's great to be here. So today I'm going to talk about Zacheus, and so most of you will know Zacheus from Sunday school and stories told about this man climbing a tree and to get a better view of Jesus. So if you want to open your Bibles, you could turn to Luke 19. So Luke chapter 19, and it's just verse 1. Right, so Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through the town. There was a man there named Zacheus. He was the chief tax collector in the region, and he had become very rich. He tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed up a sycamore fig tree beside the road, for Jesus was going to pass that way. When Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacheus and called him by name. "Zacheus," he said, "quick, come down. I must be a guest in your home today." Zacheus quickly climbed down and looked and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the people were displeased. "He has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner," they grumbled. Meanwhile, Zacheus stood before the Lord and said, "I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord, and if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much." Jesus responded, "Salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost." So Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem for the last time, actually. So he was coming from the region of Perea. Jericho was a really nice, almost like a resort, a place where a lot of rich people would go, royalty, priests. So a place for lots of wealthy. It was really nice. They had like rose gardens, palm trees, really nice tropical climate. So really popular destination, almost like a holiday resort. It was also like a crossroads. So it was north of Egypt, south of Damascus. Caesarea was to the west, and it was also obviously on the road to Jerusalem. So probably really busy, lots of people, and lots of wealthy as well. Zacheus, one of these. So he was the chief tax collector. It's mentioned he was very rich. He was also short in stature. So he was the chief tax collector. So he was obviously the head of a lot of other tax collectors. And the way it worked in those days was that the Romans obviously occupied Jerusalem and Israel, and they would charge really high taxes. So the tax collectors would be required to pay a certain amount. It would almost be like to the highest bidder. So they'd pay this amount. They wouldn't get a salary or anything. They would literally just charge a bit more than what was needed and just scrape off the top for themselves. A lot of them would charge a lot more than what was needed, and so they'd make themselves very rich. But as a result of this, they were hated not only by the Romans, but by the Jews as well. So not very popular people. Zacheus, yet not many people liked him. They referred to him as a notorious sinner. Very short, very rich, wealthy, but he was curious to see Jesus. And obviously something inside of him was not content with his life. And he's wealthy, he probably had everything he could want, but he wasn't happy and he wanted more, to the point where he would step out of his comfort zone. And it said he ran ahead to the tree, and in that custom it was almost, it would be shameful for a person of Middle Eastern origin to run. So the fact that he ran at the tree, or probably with his hood on, trying to hide himself, and then the sycamore tree is quite short, kind of wide, stretched out branches, so it would have been a nice place for him to access because he's quite short, but then also lots of cover as well. So it was a blossoming fig tree, so he would be able to hide there, no one would see him, and it was a nice place for him to just see what was going on, see what was happening. So there was a big crowd. They probably all hated him, so they obviously weren't going to let him through and let him see Jesus, and so he didn't even bother going through the crowd. So he thought, okay, well, Jesus is going to probably pass this way. The sycamore trees are normally just outside the city, so it was probably just on the way out. He probably thought to himself, well, maybe the crowd has died down a little bit, and he would then get an opportunity to see Jesus. And what he was looking for, I don't know. I mean, I believe he was most likely prompted by the Holy Spirit and said to go out there and see what was going on. And obviously, we're all drawn to a crowd, and many of you have social media, and it is quite easy to just scroll through and see what's happening, and we often have this fear of like missing out what's going on, and it was a bit like that for Zacheus. We're all searching as well, and we can search in all these places, Facebook, we can search books, self-help books, anything, but really the only real meaning to life is found in the Scripture, and that is Jesus, really. So we don't really need to look any further than him. Now, it's almost like seems quite an insignificant thing, Zacheus just climbing a tree. But often God uses the mundane, the almost things that seem meaningless in our lives to bring about his amazing, miraculous power and works. And there's examples in the Bible. So, for example, Moses was a baby in a basket, and it was just his tears, really, something, again, small, insignificant, that stirred the heart of Pharaoh's daughter, and she then adopted him. It was something small and seemingly insignificant as a widow who had just a bit of flour and a bit of oil, who then supported and cared for Elijah when he stayed with her, or Elisha, I think it was. And there's lots of other examples in the Bible where God uses something really small, and he's doing it in our lives all the time, and often we just don't see it. And sometimes we think to ourselves, well, what am I really doing to make a difference? But we look here, all he did was climb a tree, and Jesus just changed everything. So it's important that we just don't almost look over these things and just trust that God's strength is in our weakness, and he's going to work through whatever is going on in our lives. It was quite an undignified thing for him to do. He had lots of cover. He was hiding in the tree, and he had to step out of the comfort zone, and in order to see Jesus. And yes, he probably was trying to hide as well, but it would have had to take some sort of courage and strength to take that step of just climbing a tree. And you don't see, it's not every day you see a grown man climbing a tree. So it's something he did which almost led in pursuit of Jesus. And it's also important for us to just step out our comfort zones and not be ashamed, not be afraid to reach out, and to because in that place then we'll find Jesus, and he finds us. In verse 6 it talks about, so he said, Zacchaeus climbed quickly down from the tree and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. It then goes on to say that the people were grumbling, and they were displeased. They've gone to be a guest of a notorious sinner. And how could he associate with someone so sinful? And in chapter 18, so the chapter just before this one, there's quite a few parables, and three really stand out. So the first one is about two men who go to the temple and to pray. And one of them was a Pharisee, and the other one was a tax collector, funny enough. And the Pharisee went to the temple and prayed and lifted up his hands, probably seeing if everyone was watching him and blowing his trumpet, as Jesus would say, and said, Lord, thank you that I'm not like the prostitutes and like those sinners. Thank you that you've made me righteous, and thank you that I'm especially not like that tax collector there. And then it turns to the tax collector, and he wouldn't even dare to look up to heaven, eyes to the ground, and he beat his chest in sorrow and said, Lord, I'm a sinner, forgive me. And I have nothing to give you. All I can do is, I think it says, I give a tenth of my income, and I do what I can, but I'm a sinner, Lord, I need your help. And then the end of that parable, Jesus said it was the tax collector who was justified, not the Pharisee. And the word justified, so I did a bit of reading on it, it basically means, it's almost like, in this context, it's having his sin removed from him. So the tax collector had his sin removed from him, the Pharisee didn't. And the reason why was because the Pharisee was counting on his righteousness and not God's righteousness, and not the righteousness of Jesus. He was counting on what he'd done. And yes, he also thanked God for the righteousness. Thank you for the work, your righteousness that you're working in me. And God does that to us. So through his Holy Spirit, he's continually working his righteousness in us. But that's not the righteousness that we can rely on. We can only rely on, for our salvation, we can only rely on the righteousness of Jesus for our salvation. After that, yes, God does work through us, and you see that change in Zacheus. But Zacheus giving half of his wealth to the poor and repaying back 4 times as much to anyone who cheated him, that's not what saved him. That was after he was saved. He was saved when Jesus came, and he was saved through Jesus' presence and having that faith. Now, this is the only example really where Jesus was not invited. So normally Jesus would wait for an invitation, then he'd go along. But in this case, he says, I'm coming to your house. Are you ready? And I mean, how would you respond to that? Would you be ready for Jesus if he said today, I'm coming to your house today, are you ready? And there's that expression, home is where the heart is. And in a way, you're saying, Zacheus, I'm coming into your heart today, are you ready? And he probably thought as well, Jesus is probably not going to like what he finds there. But Jesus wants to come into our hearts as they are. He doesn't want us to have it tidy first, maybe sweep a few things under the carpet. He wants to come now, and because that's where Jesus works. He wants to bring the healing, and he wants to bring peace and joy to us. And he can't do that if we're hiding things from him. So yeah, Jesus was quite forward, quite bold in that example. And he invited himself. And you'll notice that almost in every encounter with God and with Jesus, it's very personal. So if you think back to Moses and the burning bush, it was just Moses and God. If you think back to Abraham, again, it was just the stars and creation. And he was looking at the stars and just him and God, that personal relationship. Almost any conversion story is personal. You've got Jesus and the woman at the well, just them two. You've got Paul and Jesus, and it was just them. So he's a very personal God, and he called him by name. He said Zacheus, and the name Zacheus means innocent or pure, and he probably wasn't really living up to that name at the time. But I believe when Jesus called him Zacheus, he almost meant that. He meant Zacheus, innocent, pure person, come down from the tree, and it was probably the first time he had heard his name used in terms of kindness since he was on his mother's knee and since he was a child. So I think that's almost what brought him so much excitement and joy, is that someone's actually calling me by my real name, which is, that's who I am. I'm innocent. And we sang that song, I am who you say I am. God, Jesus said to him, you're innocent, you're pure. And it was only really when Jesus then called him by name that he was able to respond and invite Jesus into his home and into his heart. And I think an important thing to draw from this is also, what did Jesus give Zacheus? He didn't give Zacheus any money, and he didn't really heal him of anything, really. I mean, he healed his heart. But what Jesus really gave Zacheus was time. And he gave him an evening. He gave him that afternoon. He said, I'm coming to your house today, your house, not anyone else's, and not for any reason, just because I want to spend time with you, just because I want to talk with you. And I think spending time and attention is one of the greatest gifts we can give someone. Any of you have children will know that the thing children value most is attention and time. They don't mind too much about gifts, and yes, it's nice, but I think what they really want is your time and you being there. And that's what Jesus gave Zacheus. There's earlier in the New Testament, it talks about Mary and Martha, and Martha was rushing around doing all the stuff for getting the lunch ready. Mary was just sitting listening to Jesus, and she then complained. She said, tell her to come and help me. Like, she's just sitting there doing nothing. It's not fair. But Jesus said, Mary has found what's really important, and it's not going to be taken away from her. And she'd found the presence of God, and she wanted to spend that time with him. Another example of time is, there was this chap, and his father was an alcoholic, grew up really rough upbringing. When his father was around, he's very abusive, but most of the time he wasn't. And he recalls many times when he was at a football game, and they'd have Father on Sunday, and he'd be there on his own, and everyone else would be there with their father. So very difficult relationship for him and his father. And his father eventually died when he was a young teenager as an alcoholic, just passed out in the snow one night and just froze to death. But this guy, so this chap, I won't tell you who it is yet, is he recalls one time when his brothers, so he had an older brother, and his brother and his friends came around one time, and I think they were playing in the garden, and one of his brother's friends chose actually to just stay in the house today and just spend some time with this kid. And he just sat with him, and they built Lego together, and I think built a train set or something, and he just values that so much because he never had that from his father or from anyone really. And yet that stranger, that person he didn't know, came and just spent that time with him, and that just meant so much to him, and that's what he was really longing for. This man actually went on to be, he's currently the head of Focus on the Family, Jim Daly. And growing up having no father around really, and now he's head of Focus on the Family, it's quite kind of ironic. But his experiences led him to, I think there's two ways he could have gone. He could have either said he kind of follows in his father's footsteps, or he could say, actually, because of that, I want to be the difference. I didn't want to have that for my children, and that's what he did. And he said, actually, no, I want to be a good father to my children, and that's what he did and has become. And Jesus, he also valued time. On the cross, he was nails in his hand, he was beaten, he was whipped, and he didn't really cry out anything until physically he was just destroyed. It was only up to the point where he lost that connection from his father, and he felt that abandonment, and that's when he cried out, like, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means like, my God, why have you forsaken me? And Jesus valued time with his father and had always had that since he was born, since before creation. And for that one moment, for the first time, he was separated because of our sin. And that was when he cried out. That was when he was in the most pain and agony. So time is so important, and it's so important we give time. And sometimes I find it difficult to know what to say to people. I would love to see all the teachers and all the kids at my school be saved, but sometimes I just don't know what to say. Sometimes I feel restricted, but I think the best thing you can give is just time. And so I try and just make sure I put people over task and over the work I need to do, and just make sure I spend that one-on-one time with students, just talking to them, not talking about my faith or anything, but just talking about them and sharing experiences. And there's been many times when I just felt God speaking through me. I haven't mentioned the Bible, I haven't mentioned Jesus, but I've just felt God there. So just time is such a big thing, and that was actually the original thing that God gave me for today, but it's a bit more now. John the Baptist, so it mentions I think it's in Matthew, that lots of people came to be baptized, and many of them were actually tax collectors. And so John then said to them, they said, what should we do now? And he said, well, don't collect any more tax than you need to, and don't cheat people out of tax, which is then what what Zacheus then went on to do. So he said, I'm going to give half of my wealth to the poor and repay back 4 times as much as of what I've cheated from people. So that almost leads into the next to verse 8, where Zacheus then did that. So he said, he stood before the Lord and said, I will give half my wealth to the poor, and if I've cheated people of their taxes, I'll give them back 4 times as much. Again in verse 8, in chapter 18, so the previous chapter, Jesus tells a parable about, sorry, it's not a parable, it's a rich man comes to see him, and this man says, Lord, I've followed the commandments, and he actually starts with a question, which is the greatest commandment? And Jesus said, well, love your neighbor as yourself, and love the Lord your God with all your heart. And he says, well, I've done all these things. And then Jesus says, well, there's one thing left for you to do. Sell everything you have and come and follow me. And with that, the man turned away in sorrow, for he was very wealthy. And this man's response was very different from Zacchaeus'. Zacchaeus chose then to actually do that and give away half his wealth and he following Jesus ultimately. Jesus then, after that story, he then went on to say that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle for a rich man to enter into heaven. So many who were probably wealthy said, well, who can be saved then? And Jesus said, well, what's impossible for man is possible with God. And it's funny how this was almost the last really act before Jesus went on to Jerusalem. And raising people from the dead, healing people of blindness, of leprosy. All those were amazing miracles, but this is almost one of the greatest because it was something that seemed impossible. There weren't many rich people who found salvation, and yet Jesus reached out to this one man, Zacheus, the chief tax collector, and he was completely transformed from the inside out. Jesus also talks about having two masters, and you can only have one master. If you love one, you'll hate the other, and you can only serve God and money. And I think all his life, God or money, and all his life Zacchaeus his God was money, really. He was a tax collector, and that's who he was serving. So he wasn't capable of loving God. He couldn't serve two masters. But when Jesus came, he made that change, and he suddenly had a new master. And that master was different to his old one, and that master changed him. So I thought someone had their hand up there. There's a story I heard recently about a Native American, and so this was a few hundred years ago, and he happened to be sat in a church service, probably a bit like this one, and he just didn't feel at peace, and he just felt that this kind of restlessness inside of him. So he thought, well, there must be something I can do, something I can give to relieve this. And so he came up to the front to the altar and said, "Indian, bring bow," his bow and arrow, and he lays it at the altar, and then he went and sat down again. But he still just had this restlessness inside of him, and just didn't feel content. So then he thought, well, what else can I give? So he goes outside and gets his horse and walks his horse down to the altar and says, "Indian, bring a horse." And went and sat down again. Again, he still didn't feel at peace. And then he said, well, there's nothing else he can give. So then he walked to the front and stood at the altar and said, "Indian, bring Indian." And then he just felt this peace, and he just felt this acceptance and love. And ultimately that's what Zacchaeus had done. Yes, he gave away half his wealth and so on, but he first came to Jesus, and he brought Zacchaeus, bring Zacchaeus. He came to Jesus, and Jesus, when Jesus entered his home and welcomed him and called him by name, Jesus then responded with, "Salvation has come to this home, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham." So the word salvation, the Jewish meaning of the word is Teshua, which sounds very much like Yeshua, and that's not actually a coincidence. So they've got the same root word, which is Yasha, so the Lord of our salvation. And so when Jesus said salvation has come to this home, it almost had like two meanings. So yes, salvation, this man had found salvation, but also Jesus had come, and he was that salvation. Jesus then mentioned about him becoming a true son of Abraham. In Romans 4:11, it talks about Abraham was made righteous by his faith, not by who he was. So he wasn't saying he was a true son of Abraham because of his heritage or because of who he was in that way, but rather by faith. He became a spiritual son, just as we are spiritual children of Abraham through our faith. Jesus also went on to say that he could turn these stones, he could be turned into sons of Abraham. And so the whole thing about being related by blood to Abraham is not really as meaningful as being a spiritual son of Abraham, which is by faith. So it's by faith that we are made righteous and justified. So in that parable about the two men who went to the temple to pray, it said that it was the tax collector who was justified, because he said, there's nothing I can bring, Lord, it's you I'm relying on. And so it was God's salvation that he needed, and Jesus' righteousness that he relied on. And that's what made him, and it was through his faith that he became righteous rather than anything else. In verse 10, then Jesus said, the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost. So yes, Jesus sought him, and Jesus is the one who called him down from the tree. Jesus is the one who came to his house, and Jesus comes as salvation. But Zacchaeus also had to be in that place at the right time, and yes, I believe he was led by the Holy Spirit. Jesus is saying that he's come to save those and seek and save those who are lost. He also says earlier that it's not healthy people that need a doctor, it's the sick people. And he can't save us unless we know we're lost. If we think we're not lost, then we can't be saved. But Jesus goes out and he finds those who are lost and who know they're lost and who know they're sinners, and who are beating their chest before him in repentance, and he goes out and he leaves the 99 and he goes out to save that one lost person. So there's two parables I mentioned. So the two men who went to pray at the temple, the Pharisee and the tax collector. There was the rich man who came and said, "What do I need to do?" And Jesus said, "Give away all your wealth." And there's also the parable in the same previous chapter on where the children come to Jesus and they just want to be in his presence and spend time with him. And so his disciples said, "No, get rid of them." And then Jesus said, "No, let them come. For anyone who welcomes children welcomes me." And to enter the kingdom of heaven, you have to almost be like these children. So those three parables are almost like 3 points I want to draw from the story of Zacheus that I kind of link in. So the two men who went to pray at the temple, I think it's just so important for us to remember that it's not what we bring, it's what Jesus has done for us, and it's what he gives us. And we can't rely on our own righteousness, even if some of that righteousness is from God. It's Jesus who we rely on. And also the Pharisee looked down on that tax collector and said, "Well, thank you, I'm not like him, that notorious sinner." But we're all sinners, and sometimes it's easy to look down on people and say, "Well, there's no chance of them being saved," or there's no hope for them. Or everyone has a chance to be saved, and Jesus is welcoming everyone, and his message, the gospel, is exclusive. It includes everyone. The parable of the children, I think just that importance of time and spending time with people. And I'm sure you've all can name me many people in your lives who you want to see saved. And I think the best way of doing that, in the same way that Jesus gave Zacheus that time, is just give people time and just listen. And most people will then, when you give people that time, because most people long for that, and especially nowadays with social media and with things, people are very isolated and people have that longing for fellowship with others. And so when you give people that time, you're almost meeting that need, and they're in response to that are going to open their hearts to you, and they'll ask the questions. You don't need to tell them about your faith. They'll ask you and they'll say, like, "What is different about you?" And I've heard many stories of people who've experienced that. And then the third point about the rich man coming before Jesus and said, "What can I do?" And he says, "Well, sell all your possessions." It's quite easy for us to think, "Oh, I need to do this. I've done this commandment. I've done that. I've ticked that box, and I must be doing the right thing now." But ultimately, Jesus wants us. He wants you to bring yourself to the altar, and that's all he wants, really. All the other stuff comes from that. And when Jesus changes us, he changes us from the inside out. He changed Zacheus from the change was first in his heart, and then that flowed out through his actions and through being generous. So no one is too far gone. Zacheus, the rich man, it seemed impossible for him to enter the kingdom of heaven, but yet Jesus rescued him, and so no one can't be saved. Jesus changes us from the inside out. Now, another just point I'd like to make is just that so obviously this was Jesus' last trip through Jericho. He wasn't going to pass through there again. After that, he went to Jerusalem and he was crucified and then rose from the dead and then ascended to heaven. And so if Zacheus had said to himself, "Well, actually, it's quite a bit sunny out there today. I'll go tomorrow. I'll find him another time." I'm sure when he leaves Jerusalem, he might pass through Jericho again. Or he might have said, "Well, actually, there's so many people out there. I'm not going to go out there. It's too busy." And he could have procrastinated, and he could have said, "Well, just put it off till next time." And many times we do that. But he only had that one chance. And if he didn't take that, if he didn't climb that tree that day, he would have missed it, and he would have carried on as a notorious sinner for the rest of his life. So it's really important that we don't procrastinate and that we don't put things off. God's not going to be calling us forever, and if I'm sure most of you have been saved, but if you haven't, it's not going to be forever that God's going to be calling you. And we only have this life really on earth, this opportunity, and we need to take it, and there's no better time than now. So no one is too far gone, and we should never give up on people. So there's people in our lives who are very, and I think the most difficult thing sometimes is people are opposed to the gospel, and you have some people who just really hate your faith or hate you because of it, and I can think of people in my life, and there's been many times when I haven't really been acting as Christ would around them, and because it is very difficult when people are really opposed, you're really anti. It's difficult, but Paul talks about love as never giving up, and we should never give up, and Jesus never gave up on us. To the point where he's on the cross, he still never gave up. To the point where he's separated from his Father, he still never gave up on us. And so Jesus is always knocking, and home is where the heart is. Jesus is knocking on the door of our hearts, and it's when we invite him in, his presence alone is the thing that changes our lives, and his presence alone is what enables us to do things we never thought we could. And it's by his Spirit, so not by might or power, but by the Spirit of God that lives in us, that we are changed and transformed. And that is then seen on the outside, and that draws people to us and to Christ in us. So I'd just like to finish off just by saying that so Jesus is calling us out of the tree in the same way that Zacheus was in that tree. Sometimes we climb up a tree, and whether we're hiding from God or whether we're trying to see him but from far off without anyone noticing, Jesus is calling us out of a tree, and for whatever reason we've put ourselves in that tree. To enable Jesus to call us out, he had to be nailed onto a tree, onto a different tree, and I think it's just funny how, like, if you think back to Adam and Eve, they picked fruit from a tree that almost led to them being separated from God and almost ending up in a tree like Zacheus. But then it was Jesus who was then nailed to a tree, and that enabled him to draw everyone to himself and to rescue us and save us. So Jesus is always knocking, and he's not always going to be knocking, but I think we should take the opportunity now and not put it off if we have been. So yeah, Jesus has saved those who are lost. He came to seek and saved those who are lost, and he did that through the cross. So yeah, that's everything I'd like to say today. Thank you for listening.